So we're the three fractals. So back in 2016, when John and I got going, we recognized that there were three organizations in Canada that were doing excellent work but working separately and organizing conferences, doing contract research and et cetera, and about the same topic, best practices in anti-corruption. And these organizations had different core competencies. The Peter A. Allard School of Law, of course, was doing academic courses. I was teaching them graduate research, academic scholarship in this area. The International Center for Criminal Law Reform, ICLR, is a United Nations affiliated commission research center. And in 2021 gave birth to the Vancouver Anti-Corruption Institute. And Transparency International Canada chapter, of course, is TI is the leading NGO in this field in Canada, connected with the leading NGO globally, and whose function is to raise awareness and to advocate for policy changes in the area of anti-corruption. So in 2016, then John and I decided, and put together a working partnership among these three organizations to do joint work in the same field of, organizing top-rated continuing professional education, whether it's seminars, conferences, webinars, colloquia. So in a sense, what we did was put together our form of collective action where we teach each other about best practices in anti-corruption. And we've done since then about 40 actual events. Ironically, in 2020 and 2021, coming out of the pandemic, where we couldn't meet in person, which is what we'd done for the first 4 years, and with the support of Dr. Carol Yao at the Center for Business Law at Allard, and who stepped up and started to provide the technical support so that we could do online events. And so we've been able to do many more events and attract a much broader range of panelists like today. And we've had registrants from all over North America, Europe, Africa, even Australia, to our programming. So thanks very much, Carol, and your technical team, led today by Sarah Elizabeth Lady McDonald, who we've been working a lot with in the last couple of weeks, and with the support of Dean Pendrell at Allard Law School. Thank you. And so this UBC connection reminds me that UBC is, and we'd like to acknowledge that with gratitude that the UBC campuses are located on the traditional unceded territories of 4 First Nations in Canada, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh for the Vancouver campus, and the Sajiks in UBC's Kelowna campus. So we'd also like to thank the continuing very active support of Dr. Peter German at ICLR, James Cohen, who's the executive director of Transparency International Canada. And we're going to hear from my colleague on the board, the chair of our board, Susan Cote-Freeman, who's going to provide the concluding remarks today. So a few words about the inspiration for today's program. About 3 years ago, I had the privilege of supporting the application of Dr. Alex Komarov to be a visiting scholar at UBC Law School. And Alex came to Vancouver in 2021. He got involved in the anti-corruption law program as our research associate, and then returned later that year to Ukraine to continue his work as a professor and also as an expert in anti-corruption law on a European Commission kind of mandate. So, and it's largely through Alex's efforts and networks that this program was conceived and organized, and worked closely with, my colleagues, John Ritchie and Norm Baldwin. So that's the background of how this got going. So why this topic? we know that Canadians want to help, want to support Ukraine in resistance to the Russian invasion. But how can we mobilize the community that has developed around the anti-corruption law program? And there are literally thousands now who've registered for our programming. How can we mobilize them to help? How can the anti-corruption law platform be used to attract interested and motivated people from Canada and from Ukraine and elsewhere to get involved? And how? To share ideas about best practices to protect the integrity of the reconstruction of infrastructure. What intelligence and experience can we share? What can Ukraine learn from the Canadian experience? What can Canada learn from the Ukraine experience? How can we teach each other about this critical topic? Safeguarding the integrity of infrastructure reconstruction. So I'm so honored that the panelists from Ukraine of the stature that Alex has been able to attract have joined us today to start this conversation. Thank you. And it's my privilege to now introduce our moderator, Dr. Alex Komarov. He's an associate professor at the Ukraine Catholic University. As I said, he's working as an anti-corruption expert on the European Anti-Corruption Initiative based in Kyiv. He's got a master's of law from Yale Law School in 2020, a PhD in law from Yaroslav Mudry National University in Ukraine in 2015. So thank you, Alex, for taking the lead with John Ritchie and Norton Baldwin to organize this seminar. So over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Joe, for this kind introduction, and thank you to the Anti-Corruption Law Program for giving our esteemed panel and me the opportunity to speak and have a discussion today on prevention corruption in the reconstruction of Ukraine. Welcome to all our participants. We probably have participants from all across the globe today. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, depending on the time zone you are currently in. The topics that we are going to discuss today is an infinite one. It is truly impossible to cover everything within 2 hours. The unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine has been daily taking a profound and devastating toll in human lives loss, destruction of property, shattering of communities, breaking economic ties, making businesses go bankrupt, and disrupting, obviously, civilian infrastructure. The cost of this aggression cannot be overstated. Just 2 days ago, we learned about a new dreadful act of terror, blowing up Kakhovska hydro power plant, Kakhovska Dam, unleashing flooding that could potentially threaten hundreds of thousands of residents, as well as creates a real risk for a nearby Zaporizhia nuclear plant. And we have to reflect upon these costs, not only to understand the magnitude of the tragedy, but also to galvanize our collective resolve in supporting Ukraine's recovery, reconstruction, and path to peaceful and prosperous European future. I am deeply grateful to the Anti-Corruption Law Program for setting up the series of events on Ukraine's reconstruction and how to do things right. We opened the series today with the idea of introducing the participants to the current state of affairs. We are aware that the level of awareness of what Ukraine is, what has been happening in the country, and how it has changed since the Revolution of Dignity in 2014 may vary among audience. So we will start this session today with the attempt to draw a general picture of what the country has been doing to address corruption since 2014, what was the rationale behind that, what went right and wrong, perhaps, and then we will delve into the current situation, the scope of damage inflicted, the reconstruction priorities, existing organizational planning, existing anti-corruption safeguards, and current challenges that government, business, and civil society are facing. And the purpose of this series is multifaceted. First, it is to learn and to educate each other on the current state of organizational planning and perceived risks, on what global community may learn about Ukraine and from Ukraine. Second is to try to identify which parts of Ukrainian anti-corruption safeguards shall and need to be enhanced. What is the experience and good practices that professionals in Canada and international community possess that can make a valuable contribution to making this reconstruction successful. Finally, we hope to be able to create a valuable contribution by creating a working group in order to assist Ukraine in reconstruction planning and contribute the expertise to those areas in which it is needed the most, with a specific focus on oversight of infrastructure development. I encourage our audience today to participate in the discussion. In case you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send them in through the platform. There is a Q&A icon in the bottom of your screen, so please feel free to type in your questions and we will try to discuss them to the extent we can. We will have a specific time slot allocated for answering questions from the audience, but feel free to take full advantage of our panelists today and send in your questions at any moments of the webinar. The structure of our discussion today will be the following. I will start with asking each panelist introductory questions, and I ask you to keep your answers within 10 minutes. Then we will move to roundtable discussion part and then questions from our audience. But once again, dear viewers and listeners, feel free to send in your questions at any moment. Having said that, let me introduce you to our brilliant panel today. We have people on the panel that have deep knowledge of Ukraine in various professional capacities and represent government, civil society, the interest of business community, independent non-profit organizations focusing on countering corruption and improving standards of governance, and global initiatives improving transparency and accountability in public infrastructure. Okay, let me start. Our first speaker today is Mr. Roman Vashuk. Mr. Vashuk is a business ombudsman in Ukraine since January 2022. Prior to taking this important position, Mr. Vashuk served as the ambassador of Canada to Ukraine from 2014 to 2019, and ambassador of Canada to Serbia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia from 2011 to 2014. Roman joined the Foreign Service in 1987, had a brilliant career there. Mr. Vashuk is well known in Ukraine as a great friend of Ukraine, and we are looking forward to hear from you today. Welcome, Roman. Due to unpredictable circumstances, Mr. Vashuk will be able to be with us just for the first 45 minutes of the webinar. So if you do not mind, I will start with you after introducing our panel, and I encourage our audience to take full advantage of Roman's time with us. So welcome once again. Roman will be joined by Andrei Borovik. Andrei Borovik is Executive Director of Transparency International Ukraine. Andrei is an expert with more than 5 years experience in business consultation, investment analysis, and business processes in the public sector. He has also professional experience working in the public sector, heading a unit at the Department for Reforms in the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine. And in 2016-2019, he was Deputy Executive Director of Transparency International Ukraine, and since 2019, he has been its Executive Director. I would not fear to say that Transparency International Ukraine is the strongest civil society player working in the area of anti-corruption and good governance reform, and they have been actively involved in reconstruction planning since early on, so we are looking forward to hearing from you, Andrei, today. Welcome. Our next speaker is Natalie Forsuk. Natalie is a governance and transparency expert in the field of infrastructure. For 12 years, she worked in the business sector, and following the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, she shifted her career path towards improving Ukrainian governance. During 2016-2019, she became a recognized expert in transparency, accountability, and governance in public infrastructure procurement. As the Coast Ukraine country manager, in 2019, Natalie was appointed a Deputy Minister of Infrastructure, covering road infrastructure and transport, as well as EU integration and I-5 funded projects. In 2021-2022, she served as the head of EU Integration Office in the Secretariat of the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, coordinating EU membership application, earning an award from the Cabinet of Ministers for her personal contribution. Welcome, Natalie. We have Johanni Grossman with us today. Johanni leads the Basel Institute and Governance Green Corruption Program and is a senior advisor for Central and Eastern Europe. Prior to joining the Institute, he spent 9 years leading anti-corruption and good governance programs in Indonesia. And as far as I'm concerned, Johanni is joining us from Indonesia today as well. So it's pretty late for you. Basically, you are very well, Johanni is very well familiar with Ukraine, as his engagement with the country has started back in early 2000s when he was leading the biggest election observation mission, monitoring the 2004 presidential elections and uncovering widespread election fraud. After the Orange Revolution, Johanni advised the new government in strengthening anti-corruption reforms, and now you are working with Ukraine once again. Recently, you published a report on forestry corruption, and I know that the Basel Institute on Governance has been active in your work on safeguarding Ukraine's reconstruction from corruption, cooperating both with the government and civil society. Welcome, Johanni. We are looking forward to hearing your thoughts today, and I see we are already joined by Serhiy Derkach. Serhiy is the Deputy Minister for Communities, Territories, and Infrastructure Development of Ukraine, with the primary responsibilities in directing and coordinating the formation and implementation of state policy in the areas of road transport and road management, aviation transport and infrastructure, and safety in transport. Even more importantly for our today's discussion, Serhiy is also responsible for the implementation of the policy on preventing and combating corruption in the ministry. Before joining the ministry in February 2023, for more than 3 years, before that, Serhiy served as the head of the Department for Prevention and Detection of Corruption of the National Agency on Corruption Prevention of Ukraine. And even before that, since 2015, he worked in several donor-funded projects directed at civil service and anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine. So welcome, Serhiy. Welcome to all our panelists. And I guess we can begin with our first round. So looking back a little bit, in the year of 2014, that was kind of a crucial moment in Ukrainian history. The moment when the Revolution of Dignity happened, the former president Yanukovych and his government escaped to Russia. The new temporary government was created, and suddenly everyone was talking about corruption. Corruption that led to all the civil unrest, Constitutional Court decision that basically allowed Yanukovych to usurp the power, former President Yanukovych. Corruption that drove police to follow the illegal orders and beat students protesting at Maidan in Kiev. Corruption that shackled courts back then when they were announcing unjust rulings against peaceful protesters. All that suddenly became so obvious, and there was this momentum to capitalize upon reforms. Having said that, I would like to invite our first speaker, Roman Vasyuk. Mr. Vasyuk, you served as an ambassador of Canada to Ukraine, and you started that position right in time when the Revolution of Dignity has already happened. Ukraine just got a new president, parliamentary elections were in their final stage, Crimea has already been illegally annexed by Russia, and the active military conflict was ongoing in the eastern part of Ukraine. But at the same time, there was this expectation and anticipation that this was a time for Ukraine to change. There was this momentum for reforms in the air, and there was this demand from Ukrainian society to implement the reform that will signalize a radical break with the past and fight against corruption, which was perceived an endemic problem of Ukrainian government, was on top of the agenda. The international community took quite proactive stance in supporting the implementation of anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine. Many options were considered. Eventually, Ukraine ended up creating a specialized set of champion institutions, specialized independent agencies to fight and prevent corruption effectively, including National Agency on Corruption Prevention, National Anti-Corruption Bureau to investigate high-profile crimes, Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, Asset Recovery and Management Agency, and finally, on top of all of that, High Anti-Corruption Court specifically to adjudicate on the high-profile corruption cases. Obviously, that was just a part of the reforms, and broader structural reforms were also happening. So if I may ask you to share some of your reflections over that time and how the country changed in the years preceding the 2022 full-scale invasion, how do you assess the progress made in combating corruption during your tenure, and what were some of the key challenges and achievements you observed?
Let me actually go a bit further back into the mists of time, to the late 80s, early 90s. I was on my first posting in Moscow, but also covering Kiev. And going back that far helps answer the question of why is Ukraine not Poland? Or why is Ukraine not like the Czech Republic, which is the deeply provincial state in which Ukraine was when it started out on its road to independence, and lacked the kind of modern economic elites that could have laid the groundwork for a different sort of ethics in business. You then found a sort of very post-Soviet based approach, kind of grounded in the assumption of bad faith. Everyone's trying to fool everyone else, and you need extremely complex legislation to be able to deal with it. And Ukraine developed, based on its existing continental system, a sort of hyper-continental system of extremely prescriptive legislation that is very difficult, for example, for people from common law countries to navigate. It's counterintuitive to us, but it is in the bloodstream of all the different players in the Ukrainian system. So before we talk about building the institutions of anti-corruption, what happened in the 90s and 2000s was, in a sense, the building of the institutions of Ukrainian corruption, which is a legal system, a punitive system, a business community that all mutually reinforced each other. And it's this mutual reinforcement of that, of those communities, that make corruption so hard to break. And that means that many well-intentioned attempts from 2014 on ran into an extremely resilient group of vested interests who were very influential and often managed to very subtly suborn the institutions that were created. So yeah, in 2014, civil society, which had already felt that it had been hoodwinked once in 2004, 2005 with the Orange Revolution, thought, no fooling around this time. We will try to ensure that we are in the driver's seat. And indeed, I'd say for the first year, civil society organizations performed the functions that in Canada would be performed by the Privy Council office. They essentially set the legislative agenda in 14-15. Reanimation package of reforms, and I'm sure that our Ukrainian participants were very much part of that, issued a weekly guide to parliamentarians. These are the laws you should be passing for a better, more just Ukraine. And the system had been knocked. The oligarchs were also disoriented post-revolution and initial Russian aggression. So a lot could be created, including our own business ombudsman institution, but also including all of those law enforcement entities that you described. They initially started operating. It took a while, 2.5 years for them to get staffed up, for them to get going, and then discovered that the Ukrainian courts were stacked against them. And again, the extremely formalistic Ukrainian criminal procedural code meant that as long as you had a reasonably competent lawyer, there were various points of procedure that could string your trial out till kingdom come. That got people angry. That led to the creation of the Higher Anti-Corruption Court. And it was there again that civil society and Western partners said, we are not going to allow the infiltration of potentially corrupt judges into this court. And so that court had a verification committee, an integrity committee that consisted of a majority of Western experts. And in fact, Canada's Judge Ted Zajecki was one of those, Zajechny was one of those members of that commission, and they vetted everyone. And as opposed to previous Ukrainian sort of filtration efforts in the judicial sphere, which said, if you couldn't prove somebody was bad to within nearly criminal standards, they could go through. The ethics committee operated on the basis of reasonable doubt. Is there a reasonable doubt this person is ethical? You're out. And so we've seen that the Higher Anti-Corruption Court has begun to be quite effective in putting people like judges from other jurisdictions behind bars. Now, nonetheless, because of persistent oligarchic control of the media and a sort of public numbness to all the revelations of either wrongdoing or attempts to do something about it, the public remains very skeptical. So Ukraine doesn't always get rewarded by itself or by foreign partners for the good things it's trying to do. On the one hand, Ukraine is 6 out of 34 in the European open data scale. It's way above most European peer countries, but it's 116th out of 188 on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. It has these very well-developed institutions, but a high degree of public skepticism. So, and the skepticism is driven by the sense, which is not entirely unjustified. These are things I'm discovering in my business ombudsman role, that you can have the best rules, the best institutions, but if you have a ruling class or remaining group that is able to manipulate its way around them, then all of those brilliantly designed institutions aren't going to give you the high-level results and the high-level dissuasion of corruption that you're looking for. So I think we're seeing some initial successes, but they have not really turned Ukrainians' own perceptions of corruption, and they haven't really put the fear of God into high-ranking officials who might be tempted to use pre-existing connections to benefit from what's going to benefit. And now the war, I think, put a damper on that. Initially, everyone was shocked. But just as the Ukrainian economy has proven resilient, so too have some of the ways of skimming off the Ukrainian economy also proved resilient. So I think we need the anti-corruption infrastructure to be focused on wrongdoing in the here and now, because it can occasionally be sidetracked into following rather abstract issues of zakonnost, abstract legality, in the more recent past, 2014, 2015, 2016. We've had examples which have had a chilling effect on reformists, not on corrupt insiders. So that's kind of the journey, and very much a work in progress. A lot of committed people working on it, but then hidden in the shadows, a lot of people equally committed to keeping their unfair advantages.
Thank you very much. Very interesting perspective from your side. I think many of panelists can share your view, and many basically it's really an unusual situation when we end up with civil society having strong international support, basically providing the legislative with the agenda on the reforms, and the fact that the corruption has been so rooted, and the fact that still as anti-corruption institutions evolve, the vested interests, ways to circumvent rules evolve as well, using all these formalities and formal way of interpretation of the law that is predominant in Ukraine. That's kind of very interesting insight. And given that we have very limited time with you today, I would apologize then before our other panelists and ask you one more question. You currently serve as a business ombudsman in Ukraine, and you assumed this position less than 2 months before the start of full-scale invasion. The Business Ombudsman Council was set up specifically to improve Ukrainian investment climate and to ensure greater transparency of business practices. So since the onset of Russian invasion, what are the problems that businesses face? Maybe we can learn something from the kind of their grievances, the grievances that you receive from them. Anything regarding the emerging risks and new patterns that should be addressed in order not to hinder the upcoming reconstruction?
Okay, thanks. So in the first 6 months after the full-scale invasion, we switched from dealing with complaints only to being a kind of free legal aid clinic for Ukrainian business, because again, many of the courts were closed, supply chains, business processes were disrupted. So we just figured, since we had expertise, we had funding, we would just help people on all sorts of things, rebuilding, finding new suppliers, but also dealing with things such as Ukraine's dependency on its border with the EU, some of the transboundary issues that became very important, and where then we ended up encountering the inflexibility of some EU regulations in dealing with Ukraine. Around July of 22, the pre-existing tax system swung back into action. There had been a kind of grace period, and there had been some hastily implemented liberalizing reforms, which I was initially very happy about. My staff, who of course have been in the Ukrainian tax and customs wars for years, said, Roman, you're naive. These are benefits now, but wait till they start clawing them back later. Using various formalities, you're going to see that some of these companies are going to regret having used the liberalized provisions. And indeed, we're seeing some of that, where sort of a return to existing procedures ends up penalizing those who used briefly liberalized procedures. That is unnecessarily dissuasive. But it's also the result of, I think, of Western, especially IFI advisors, not understanding the micro impact of their broad macro ideas. And one thing that I've learned, and I used to be kind of a macro pundit guy, is in dealing with Ukrainian VAT receipt issues and the value of 7,000 hryvnia, I've learned something about the micro impact. So when the IMF writes a sentence or two saying Ukraine should put greater effort into revenue generation, that translates into officials locally putting their finger on the stop button of the automated VAT system, inviting businesses in for a conversation and saying, maybe you'd like to pay more. We have a quota. There are some people out there in Washington seem to want us to collect more money. So yeah, you should legitimately be paying only this much, but maybe you want to pay more. Otherwise, you'll remain suspended. We'll declare you a risky company. So I think for the recovery period, people working on Ukraine should have some understanding of what the knock-on effects are in Ukrainian administrative reality of broad ideas that someone can express far away, which then have unintended, at least unintended by the people at the IFIs, consequences. So we're now spending a lot of time helping companies deal with these knock-on effects. And often we succeed. I mean, in about 2/3 of cases, if we get on the case at the tax office, they will say, okay, yeah, admittedly, the company is actually right. And we will register their invoices and we will offer them the tax credit, or we will refund them the fine that we unduly levied on them. But they are under pressure to over-deliver on quotas. And that then leads to behavior that, even if it isn't actually strictly corrupt, because they may not even be pocketing anything themselves, but it's abusive in terms of the state's relationship with business.
Thank you very much. So if my understanding is correct here, what you're trying to say that IFIs should come not just with demands, but with some strategies on how then to judge on performance, because frequently they set up demands for the government, and these demands on micro level translate into a set of performance indicators for officials in the tax office that just need to match them. And they're kind of incentivizing, if not corruption, then at least maladministration or mismanagement on the side of these micro level officials.
Or both. Because what happens then is that once you're suspended, then an intermediary will come and say, look, for a mere 1.5% of that suspended sum, we can fix this problem for you. Now, again, we are the alternative to that. They come to us and we take them on fair and square and generally succeed. But why create the temptation in the first place? It would be my question. And I think for the IFIs especially, you know, I'm just about to get on a train out of Ukraine because I need to be in Hamilton on Monday. But the IMF is negotiating its program with Ukraine in Vienna. Nobody has actually been here on the ground since last February. So, you know, they are literally and figuratively risk averse.
Yeah, thank you very much for this important insights, and thank you for the time that you were able to share with us today. Thank you. I don't see questions coming from the audience, so let me, to Mr. Roman, at least at this point, I see the questions on state-owned enterprises that we will discuss in a bit. Let me then move on. And with all this together, we come to February 2022 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, full-scale invasion. We all probably saw the pictures of terrible destruction of hospitals, schools, residential buildings, etc. And we read in media how throughout fall 2022, winter 2023, we actually lived through that. Russia was intentionally targeting the energy grid of Ukraine in attempts to disrupt electricity and heating supply in Ukrainian households and literally freeze the country into surrender. It never happened. And at this point, let me invite our next speaker, Mr. Sergei Derkach. We know that tremendous damage was done to the infrastructure. As of February 2023, according to the World Bank assessment, just direct damage to building and infrastructure already well exceeds $135 billion. And the need for recovery already goes well beyond 411 billion. That's just as of February. Ukraine alone seems not to have sufficient resources to cover this need. Dealing with the destruction of such a scale will require attracting a lot of funding from donors abroad, and donors comes with their perception of Ukraine's governance model, something that Mr. Roman was just telling about, and their concerns as to whether the existing procedures and structures allow for effective absorption of the influx of aid, especially given that Ukraine isn't ranked highly on transparency and public administration practices list. I know that Ukrainian government has been proactive in its thinking about reconstruction management. It presented part of its vision during Ukraine Reforms Conference in Lugano last year, and will be expanding this vision in London later this month. And there are already commitments of inflowing money and other types of aid into Ukrainian economy to deal with reconstruction. So I would like to ask you, Sergei, to provide kind of a brief overview of the extent of the damage and its impact on critical sectors so that we can understand its scope better. As well as I would ask you to comment on government priorities and on what has been the thinking of the government, how to manage the reconstruction effectively, what has already been done to that end, and what is being done as we speak. What do you see as main challenges, risks, obstacles, as well as benefits, specifically when it comes to reconstruction of infrastructure? Over to you, Sergei.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you, and thanks for the invitation. It's like really the pleasure and honor to be here with you and to speak on behalf of as a representative of the Ukrainian government. From our perspective, I mean, it's difficult right now even to speak when our armed forces actually are discharging at the front line and showing that the wonders can happen and we can win the war as soon as possible. We are trying to keep the state strong from the government perspective, but definitely, I mean, working like as usual before the full-scale invasion it's not the case. We have, as you already mentioned, Alexander, the figures that World Bank announced, that we have like 135 billions of losses estimated, and approximately more than 400 which is needed for restoration. But this is figures actually are let's say loading, you know, and scaling up during the on the daily basis. You know what happened recently with the Kakhovka in the Kherson region, where we have hydroelectric power plant. This is the crisis what we have right now, and we need to mitigate. So, I mean, when you ask about the priorities and main obstacles, actually, main obstacle is the war, which is actually, and on the daily basis, we are receiving more and more challenges and real problems that need to be tackled very quickly. So we might the time for planning it's very short one. We don't like we are trying to have the long-term perspective as well and plan for the long-term perspective in terms of post-war recovery. But right now we are very much focused on the very concrete and very fast recovery activities which are needed right now for Ukraine to actually be stable, support armed forces, and to give the possibility to our people live more or less normal life to defend the country. In terms of the damages, I mean, the numbers are huge. I will just name several of them. The damage, for example, for housing and dwellings is 37% of the total damages, and more than 1.4 million households are damaged. And 1/3 of this is absolutely destroyed. We have challenges and then the damages with the transport infrastructure, household and energy infrastructure, and these areas we need lots of funds for reconstruction. And if you are calculating it, it's like 22, 17, and 11% respectively. We have a challenge still that we have 8 million people out of Ukraine, and we have almost 6 million people which are internally displaced. Everything actually is keeping us very much in the very difficult situation at the moment. And we are trying actually to work not only, in terms of recovery procedures to rebuild the houses, schools, or some critical energy sector objects, or some critical infrastructure objects. It's actually to bring also back people home, to give them the possibility to live the normal life, and everything covers, it all covers not only with the physical reconstruction of buildings, but it comes from the crossing the border. Literally, as you know, we have the air and our sea ports are closed, which is actually made it very difficult to cross the border. At the moment, we have in Ukraine 40 border crossing points on the western border for example, automobile border crossing points, and also we have railways, which are actually carrying people and cargo. That's it, only railways and automobile, and the volume is so huge that capacity is not enough. So when we from the ministry perspective right now, looking at the topic of reconstruction, that's very broad topic, and we actually see it much more than just reconstruction, the objects that were damaged. So coming from the border, we are thinking about the road infrastructure, bridges reconstruction, also about the transportation, because we can rebuild school or we can rebuild the hospital, but if we don't have the buses and routes in the areas, especially right now in the deoccupied zones, there will be a big challenge for people who will come back to actually live normal life, and to actually go to the same school which was reconstructed, or the hospital. So it's a very complex issue that we are trying to work with. In terms of the priorities, definitely the energy infrastructure is one of the priorities for us. We are, as the Ministry of the Restoration, we call it ourselves right now, trying to actually to build a safe, the passive defense, I would say, for the energy objects. Also, we are prioritizing the critical infrastructure, which might be recovered, restored, or protected. So that's the areas which the state is thinking. We are looking at the next the winter period, where we need to be sure that everyone would have electricity and heating. So it's one of the priorities for the country and one of the priorities for the ministry itself. Another huge challenge and the priority for us is the work with the local municipalities. Because big task actually for reconstruction and recovery is not only on the state, but it's also on the shoulders of the local municipalities. In Ukraine, we have 1,600 local municipalities, and here we have two things and two challenges. One is funds, and another one is the capacity of the people who are working there. So right now we are actually preparing local municipalities for their part of the work, and planning and implementing in the future the projects for reconstruction and recovery, because small projects on reconstruction and recoveries, in terms of housing, for example, they will be dealing on by themselves. The local municipalities, and for this they need the capacity of people who are actually keen in city building, in creating the infrastructure projects. So for this perspective, we are creating the teams who will be building the capacity across the country and helping the local municipalities to submit such projects. So that's kind of very shortly, Alexander, in terms of our priorities and how we are looking forward. From
Thank
the
you.
state.
But what do you see as the main risks that can hinder the process. So you are dealing now with the huge amount of aid that is coming, and can you tell us a little bit more about perhaps procurement process for the ministry, perhaps something to do with how you utilize this aid?
In terms of risk, as I mentioned, the first main risk is the war. So the war is actually causing lots of challenges for us to reconstruct and to work properly and effectively. If we are talking about the infrastructure projects, we do understand that there are several things that might be at risk. First one, that infrastructure projects are very huge and very complex. So to implement the infrastructure project, you need to have necessary expertise, necessary resources in terms of technology, in terms of human resources, in terms of the machines and all of that stuff. The number of the projects that need to be implemented is so huge that the capacity of Ukrainian companies even might not be enough. So there is another challenge that we do need to invite to the Ukraine international companies, which might be help to reconstruct and rebuild with all their resources and with all their experience what they have. And that's what we are trying to promote at the moment. And we do understand that in the period of war, it's very difficult for international company to come to Ukraine and to go for tendering or get works done. So this is one of the big challenges. Second, definitely challenge, it's about the topic which we are talking about, it's corruption, it's integrity. We do understand that also the infrastructure projects, one of the very much risky in terms of the corruption because of the funds, the huge volume of the funds which are usually dedicated to this kind of projects. And the issue is that Ukraine didn't have in the past experience for this number of funds which are coming from the international financial institutions, from the other states. And the procedures are definitely different in terms of the procurement, in terms of the contracting, in terms of the facilitation of the projects. So from this side, we also definitely see a risk how these all possible risks should be mitigated. And definitely we as the ministry starting to work within the ministry. So we are doing right now a comprehensive corruption risk assessment and generally setting up the risk management system to see how the internal procedures in the ministry look like. Same thing goes to the Agency of Restoration, which will be responsible for the huge infrastructure projects. In terms of the real instruments which we are creating and we are hoping to use in terms of also transparency, integrity, and accountability, it's there, for example, IT tool called DREAM. This is the system which is actually right now built up with the civil society organizations, experts, and together with the Ministry of Restoration, which will give actually the full fledged information and very public in terms of what kind of projects for recovery will be set up and will be approved in Ukraine, both on the level of local municipalities and on the state level. And all the procurement information, all information about the vendors, all information about the due diligence and other stuff, and then how the project is running up, how the monitoring is done. Everything will be absolutely public. So this we see as the one of the most important instruments in Ukraine, which will give, which will actually prevent possible corruption risks. So that's, I think, one of the instruments that can be also shown to not only to Ukrainian citizens, but also to international partners to actually, let's say, to prove and ensure that in Ukraine, we are very much right now concerned about possible risks and about transparency and accountability. So from this perspective, I think we are trying to make everything happen and to be as more transparent as possible.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, so this is actually one of the examples what are the risks and how we are trying to mitigate these risks.
Yeah, thank you very much for your insightful comments and for finding time to be with us today. Let me now move and kind of build a little bit upon what you just said and move to our next speaker, Andriy Borovic, who is a representative of civil society here. And vibrant and strong civil society has always been a pioneer in advocating reforms in Ukraine, basically promoting the higher levels of transparency and accountability of public sectors, promoting better governance practices, and Transparency International Ukraine has been active in reconstruction planning as well. TI Ukraine is a member of Rise Ukraine Coalition, a coalition of Ukrainian and international organizations working for Ukraine's reconstruction integrity, sustainability, and efficiency. And I would like to ask you about your perspective on the role of civil society in the upcoming reconstruction of Ukraine. In your opinion, how do you envision the involvement of civil society in the reconstruction process? What specific roles and responsibilities are civil society organizations already playing, and what roles they can take to contribute effectively to rebuilding efforts? So perhaps you might expand a little bit on this dream system that is being developed by the ministry and with close cooperation with civil society organizations. And if you can share that, what has been your experience of cooperating with the government on the reconstruction so far? Do you see a response from the government? Or do you see lack of willingness to engage in the discussions, certain topics? Please, Andriy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. First of all, I will just remind to all of us that probably we do not even imagine all the challenges what are waiting us in the future reconstruction, because in the modern world such reconstructions never happened. And please don't tell me about Iraq and Afghanistan. This is like really bad examples for Ukraine. There is something to learn for us, but Ukraine cannot be compared to those two countries, at least because we have a state. Yeah, the country has a state. We have government. Nothing actually fell down on the 24th of February, and the government was and continue like doing what they have to do with mistakes, but they are fully operational. That's what makes us huge difference. My second point is. I quite like often saying this, that if we will look at for the last 10 years or 9 years of reforms in Ukraine, in 9 out of 10 reforms, successful reforms, they were successful because of close cooperation of three stakeholders, at least 3, sometimes 4. It's good people in the government, it's civil society, and it's international partners. In some of the reforms also we saw participation of business, like in public procurement, and lots of people from business were joining the reform of the National Bank of Ukraine and many, many others. So in the sense of the future reconstruction, I think this cooperation will be also crucial. As soon as we saw 9 years in a row that when we unite our forces, we can be successful. So why we should change it? Yeah, so this is what we have to do in the future. If talking about the role of the civil society, I more like the role of not only the watchdogging, yeah, classical watchdogging, just making lots of noise and lots of communications, pointing at mistakes. That's also a very important part of the civic oversight. But I think that at least at the initial stage, the co-creation, expertise, promoting the best practice, helping to build up the capacity, this is what the civil society should prioritize in their cooperation and in the future strategy of the reconstruction. That's how I see it. And of course, we should not forget about the different red lines. If you're talking about the transparency, for example, of the data for the reconstruction, I can't say that everything is still sorted out in Ukraine, at least these days. But now reconstruction that's happening. It's immediate reconstruction, which need to be done in order for huge territories, communities, and the country to keep running. But in the future, there will be like the red line if the reconstruction projects will not meet most of the transparency needs, or at least open data in like most of the projects. Because we have to keep in mind why I'm saying most of the projects, because we now have to remember that when we will win this war, the Russia will not disappear. Yeah, so security threats will stay, and most likely lots of things will be under constant security threat from Russia, even during the reconstruction. So I think that like this calls from civil society about open data, transparency, and accountability. Please open everything, and the position of, let's be honest, many people in the government, especially in law enforcement, saying, no, we need to close all the data. We need to find somehow the balance. The balance approach is also important. It's always hard. Yeah. So the compromise, it's a state when every side of the compromise is a little bit unhappy. So, but we have to do this if we want to build up a successful country and build back better, because all these fights, they are not building, yeah, they actually bring more bad things than the good ones. What actually the CSO is doing now, or what we're doing, we're trying to help to set up the rules for the reconstruction. I mean, looking at the institutional architecture of the reconstruction, there is lots of work which needs to be done with the laws and bylaws, and actually the countries keep running. So still what the civil society in Ukraine were doing before, doing the drafting the legislation. You mentioned the DREAM project, electronic digital reconstruction management system. This idea came from the civil society. It is now co-led by the ministry and by Open Contracting Partnership. We also helping, but in much less way. But the idea is that actually everybody see everything. The principle, the main one principle, which was used during the establishment of the public procurement reform, need to be applied to the future reconstruction. And our idea is that the whole process of reconstruction, starting from the initiation of the project and the idea till the very end of implementation, should be digitalized for two reasons. Reasons number one, as Sergei was saying, that we have a massive destruction of infrastructure, and not only infrastructure, actually. Yeah, we will have thousands and thousands of projects. The question is how to manage all of that, how to provide necessary level of transparency and accountability, and how the civil servants can manage all that things when they actually will rebuild the whole country. So this should help them. And the second one is actually give an opportunity to civil society and just to citizens to see what is going on, to track what with the reconstruction, and to give the citizens not only in Ukraine, but outside of Ukraine, in order the taxpayers of those countries which providing now, and I hope they will do this in the future, direct support to Ukraine, direct budget support, that their government not wasting money in Ukraine, that something is actually happening, and there is good results. So I would say that for civil society, it's extremely important to cooperate, extremely important to see open data, but of course, keeping in mind the security risk, and of course, trying to be more constructive than destructive in the sense of the reconstruction. Because
at this point, do you see the willingness of the government to cooperate on the matter?
Willingness of the government, honestly, starting from the 24th of February, government is much more open for communication. Yeah. So because from 2019, it was like just worse and worse and worse. With the beginning of this full-scale invasion, it became better. Are we fully happy? Of course not, because government is not obliged to accept all our ideas. Yeah, from one hand. So we have a communication. Yeah, so this is the road with both sides to move, and this is good. And I think in communication we can find better solutions. There is huge room for improvement. Yeah. I'm trying to stay positive despite all the bad news which I read during the day. And despite that, not always I'm happy what the ministry is doing, but I think we will move on and do what we can do, because the capacity in Ukraine of the government, the capacity even of the civil society is quite limited, looking at the challenges. And without this communication and the long discussions, round tables, and just calls, messages, we will there is a high risk that it will be extremely hard to build up new Ukraine without this communication. So, yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, thank you very much for this important contribution. Please stay with us. There will be many more questions coming. I assume but I'd like to continue with our next panelist today, Natalie Forsuk. Natalie, your focus of expertise is on proper infrastructure cycle management, on open data, good governance in infrastructure, identification of corruption and mismanagement risks in infrastructure. And throughout your career, you've been working both on the government side as a Deputy Minister of Infrastructure and with the government of Ukraine, with international organizations and with donors. So I'm interested in your perspective on the main challenges that should be considered during the upcoming reconstruction. What you see as a major ongoing risks related to infrastructure reconstruction. I assume that at least some of risks that were present earlier have been mitigated or eliminated throughout the last 4 years, while some new patterns perhaps are emerging at this point or are persisting over time. In your view, what are key challenges that needs to be addressed to ensure a successful and sustainable reconstruction process? What has already been done to that end? And what are the lessons learned from cost transparency infrastructure initiative and from your experience as an ex-deputy minister of infrastructure to make recovery process in Ukraine more effective, more accountable? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Thank you for the chance to participate in this discussion. First of all, I would like to go back to what Roman Vashchuk started to say, that corruption is partly something that we have received together with Soviet and post-Soviet legislation and environment, because it's very complicated and it was crafted in a special manner because nobody was really trusting anyone. And in post-Soviet environment, because in Soviet Union, there was no business, everything was belonging to state. In post-Soviet environment, the business started to develop very quickly, and a lot of gangster type businessmen appeared, which very quickly became rich and also started to control the power and money flow together with the governmental officials of that time, who were still quite tight connected with Russia in post-Soviet environment, but were very supportive to independent path that Ukraine have chosen. So coming back now to infrastructure. So during the 30 years, there were not much public money in infrastructure. I mean, public money, because private money in infrastructure were a lot. Houses were built, supermarkets, all this modern stuff. But infrastructure actually that we had, like for railways, roads, hospitals, mainly that was something that we have received from the Soviet times. And because the country was very poor after the fall of Soviet Union, there were not really much public money. And big projects were really executed mainly with the help of IFIs, World Bank, EIB, EBRD mainly, who were supporting us with big infrastructure projects. So the main risks in infrastructure are very simple. Corruption always follows the money. And in post-war, there will be a lot of money coming to Ukraine. So there will be a lot of risks in corruption. That's very obvious. There are some specific risks related to infrastructure. All infrastructure projects, the majority of middle to big size infrastructure projects, they last approximately from 5 to 25 years. Just imagine how many things can happen during this 5 or 25 years on different stage of the project. For the lawyers, it's important to understand that infrastructure projects are also connected through plenty of contracts. This is contract for the project design. This is contract for the construction itself. This is contract for supervision, and usually endless variation orders and other additional contracts and so on and so forth, which together is one big project. Now, as Andrei and Sergei already mentioned, we hope that this dream system will be able to put all this together, so we will be able to track the whole project, not the contract, and all the projects, all the contracts related to it. But still, we have to understand that what usually assumed to be like a risky area, the procurement is a very small part of a project cycle in infrastructure. And usually on the stage of procurement, half of corruption risks already happened. That's one thing. The other thing is that it's very difficult to see the difference between corruption and mismanagement risks, because in the end, you have a very poor infrastructure or delayed project or extremely high costs, and really you need very good investigators to understand what was the reason. But for the citizens, it doesn't matter actually what it was, corruption or mismanagement. So if Canadian government, Canadian citizens, Canadian NGO, university want to help, this is where you can help to increase the capacity in management skills. So people know what to do, know how to do, and use recognized practices. Why I'm talking about that? For example, IFI's, World Bank, EBRD, they work with so-called FIDIC type contracts. In Ukraine, there is very small experience in working with FIDIC type contracts. FIDIC type contracts are completely different from what is used here, because it has three parties. It has client, contractor, and a supervision engineer. And contractor is not able to talk to clients directly. He is talking only through supervision engineer. And this concept is very new. It's not widely applied. It's applied on only IFI funded projects, which are really not many. And unfortunately, IFI funded projects also suffer delayed implementations. Sometimes they are terminated, and sometimes the cost of the final project is simply twice or three times maybe too high. The third problem is rule of law. Rule of law is very important also in construction, because if contractor performs according to the contract, he has to be paid, because there is no way in FIDIC contract where contractor cannot be paid for the work that he has done. And this was a very, very common practice in Ukraine public money spending, to not pay contractors for years until they go bankrupt, and then you don't need to pay them. So there were some measures taken on that, but please take into consideration that because there were not much money public spending, the construction sector, the construction business was very undeveloped, and it started to develop really nicely after 2016, I think, when economy was a little bit better already and we had some money. The other risk, and it's a very big risk, I think, is a project design. Unfortunately, project design is like a base of everything that happens after. And this is something that for now in Ukraine is almost killed as a sector or subsector. We have very big lack of the technical project designers who can do skilled drawings, very detailed, and so on and so forth. And usually government is lacking money for proper investment in the project design. But the reality is very simple. If the project design is very bad, whatever good job is done by contractor, the result is also very bad. And in civil construction, in engineering, it also can be very dangerous for the users. Like you saw, the bridge was falling in India just a couple of days ago. So these are, I would say, the most important risks to consider. And I would say that the most important is to build the capacity not only of consulting institutions, build the capacity in governance and proper management, not only for the supporting units like offices and so on and so forth that donors usually like, but it's important to build the capacity of national and subnational government who will procure the construction, because people who work in consulting units, when their contract is finished, they will not go and work for government. So this is not something stable. This is not something sustainable when people are not staying, skilled people are not staying within the government.
Is it because of the difference in the pay scales?
Yes, the difference in the base, and now I think government officials are overstretched with tasks because, you know, we have this mentality that we are also soldiers. You know, I was in the EU office leading the process of application. You have no weekends, no nights, nothing, because like soldiers work and fight on the front line. The same governmental officials are they don't work from 8 to 5 or from 8 to 8 or from 8 to 12. They work all the time because we need a resilient government. We need this machine to work. And there are fewer and few people, and there are cuts in staff, like 30% cuts is this year very normal, but the amount of work is going higher and higher. So sometimes it's just pressure, sometimes it's both pressure and money. Yeah, all right.
Thank you very much for these contributions. I think we will come back to them. I would like to discuss it with Sergey and his experience compared to his experience when it comes to staffing and capacity and actually the ministry as it is right now during the roundtable part of the discussion. Thank you once again. Now I would like to move to the next speaker, not the least speaker for sure, the last but not the least in our introductory part. Johanny Grossman, and given your expertise and your experience, I have several questions that I'd like you to reflect upon and share your thoughts with us. First, how you think the Ukraine reconstruction process will differ or is different from other large post-conflict major donor funding reconstruction efforts. We heard from Andriy several minutes ago that he thinks that there is basically nothing to compare with, that Iraq, Afghanistan, we don't really have any kind of examples that we can really compare the upcoming reconstruction of Ukraine with when it comes to scale and when it comes to conditions in which it will be happening. Do you kind of agree on this, or do you have other view? This is the first one, and also you support Ukrainian partners, including the Ministry of Infrastructure, including the State Railroad Company and the State Restoration Agency in their efforts to assess and prevent corruption risks. Could you maybe expand a little bit more on these directions of the Basel Institute on Governance Engagement? And also, I know that Basel Institute has been actively involved in thinking and discussions about non-corruption facets of the reconstruction of Ukraine. You recently published a report a few months ago on forestry corruption. You also work with European Parliament and promoting environmental stability and governance as a part of reconstruction agenda. So could you share with us some thoughts on this matter as well? And thanks for joining us. I know that it's very late time already for you, so thank you.
No, thank you for having me, Alexander. It's a pleasure to be here, especially with such esteemed panelists and friends. Well, I certainly don't disagree with Andriy. This is a difficult to compare country. And lessons learned from Iraq and Afghanistan and other post-conflict zones, I think, are useful to a very limited degree. When thinking about the differences of Ukraine's situation, I see sort of 5 broad differences. The first, as Andriy already mentioned, Ukraine's governance structure is fully intact. Some might even argue it's more functional than before the war, and that's certainly a very unusual situation when we're talking about a full-scale attack of what was considered one of the world's major militaries. The second is sort of a flip side to the other anti-corruption, or mirror image, if you will, of the other anti-corruption efforts that have been put in place. The sort of transparency tools like DREAM transparency accountability tools, which is the area that I work on, which is strengthening the internal controls of government and the capacity to manage their own corruption risks. And that's also quite unusual in Ukraine right now, which is that I see the greatest willingness to adopt those kind of reforms that I've ever seen. Also not usually something one would think about when fighting a major war. The third difference, I think, is that the expectations on the restoration efforts are also exceptionally high. And I think here, maybe some of us in the West, some of us abroad, probably have to be a little bit careful and be a little bit realistic that, expecting a country that is at full-scale war to rebuild better with perfect European green standards, with a completely accessible and decentralized way, without corruption, and essentially build sort of Singapore during shelling, is probably an unrealistic expectation. So there will be problems in the reconstruction process. And I think those of us in the West who are supporting Ukraine have to be realistic that this is not going to be, roses and butterflies going forward. This will be very difficult. And setbacks are to be expected, including on the corruption front. There will be corruption. It's a question of how we address it, how we respond to it. Then, of course, the reconstruction, the restoration is happening as we speak, while the shelling is literally happening. I just got an alert that the shelling has started again, apparently. So that's also somewhat unusual, right? We don't know about the sustainability of restoration efforts because we don't know how long the shelling will last. And finally, perhaps on a positive note, the difference is the really unparalleled willingness of Western governments and some other governments to support Ukraine's reconstruction efforts. I think the scale of the investment will be significantly higher than we've seen in other places. Now, maybe I can just expand on that second point a little bit more, which is the government's willingness to improve systems, improve its resilient systems against corruption. Again, working with 4 different government agencies and SOEs, I really see a very significant change in this regard, a much greater willingness to actively assess its own problems, its own corruption risks, and finding ways to mitigate those and accepting difficult recommendations in how to mitigate those. So in that regard, I'm quite hopeful. I understand that as Natalie mentioned, this will come up, these systems, these defenses will come up against very formidable corruption risks once the reconstruction happens at scale. So we'll see if those defenses hold as well as the military defenses. And I'm also reassured in this regard because I think Ukraine's tolerance to corruption has also experienced significant deterioration. There's a lot less tolerance towards it since the start of the war. Perhaps the allergy level that already existed has sort of increased, if you will. And so when we see corruption scandals that we saw before, quite commonly, we see that the public's reaction is much stronger against those now. And my hope is that that will also lead to a degree of stigma that wasn't perhaps the case before. And just to wrap up about the last point you mentioned, yes, there are many elements of the restoration, of the reconstruction process to consider. Of course, we've been talking mostly about the corruption one, which is absolutely accurate, and I wouldn't deviate from that, although there's certainly, for example, environmental considerations that ought to be taken into account. But just to stress maybe that the anti-corruption efforts shouldn't just be focused on infrastructure projects, so sort of cement and steel, if you will, because there's many other subsidiary and ancillary processes that required for the restoration process that also harbor significant corruption risks. And here you mentioned the report that we recently issued on corruption in the forestry sector. The forestry sector will be quite crucial, I think, both for the restoration efforts as well as economic elements of recovery. I imagine it was going to be one of the few growth industries in Ukraine in the coming years. And the governance challenges that have been the legacy of the forestry sector haven't been addressed yet. There's some efforts that start to address this, but there's a long way to go. And so this is just one of the examples of these ancillary spaces that we shouldn't forget about as we focus on brick and mortar or steel and cement reconstruction efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johanni, for these amazing comments. Actually, I think it's a lot here to reflect upon, and perhaps basically almost every speaker, every panelist today mentioned that we are facing this problem of perhaps overwhelmingly high expectations from donors, or overwhelmingly, or extremely high, not only expectations, but perceptions of how the projects should be run. And when we are ending up with this, what I see in daily work, that the government is kind of trying to think about how to manage reconstruction in their own way. Then international donors come from different countries, and they come with their rules, their certain sets of procedures, their priorities, what they see as important in this process, what they see, and aligning of the interests of the government and the interests of the donors is not always easy task. So maybe I will now open the discussion to all of our panelists and ask you, what would be your advice on kind of what could be the good strategies that we can use to align the interest of international donors and interests of Ukrainian government in order to strike this middle ground somewhere in between? Please, who would like to take the floor? It's not an easy question, I know. It's something like, perhaps I might ask Andrei to comment a little bit. Like, let's move from international donors and let's think about civil society. When you are thinking about this, when you're having this conversation with the government and you want more transparency, government wants to prioritize security when it comes to reconstruction. So what would be the strategy that you would advance to? Where would you settle?
Look, when I was saying about the Iraq and Afghanistan that it cannot be compared to Ukraine, is just because the state of things in Ukraine and in those countries and the result of reconstruction in Afghanistan, we saw perfectly 2 years ago. Yeah. And when I was reading and talking to the Inspector General who was providing oversight and control of the reconstruction in Afghanistan, it's like like absolutely two different universes. Yeah, with all respect to the people of those countries. So I think the things which just trying to explain to what I meant by saying that it can't be compared. Usually when we're talking about the reconstruction, we always trying to find some examples from other countries, and we usually mean the experience for Ukraine and Ukrainian government and Ukrainians. But let's be honest, international community also must study those examples and to learn something from what they did wrong. If talking about Afghanistan, I read quite enough of different analysis and reports, but one of the mistakes was there was no one plan for the reconstruction, no strategic level, or maybe it was, but all the US projects at that country were up to 5 years. But how you can plan any proper reconstruction when you have only 3-5 years in order to do that? And actually people were coming from outside of the country, building something, whether it's necessary or not, sometimes not, sometimes yes, but there was no any long-term planning. There was no building up the capacity of the people of that country. And actually it became just a good project, nice place, maybe I am sure nice place to be there. But then nobody was thinking in the long term, like in 20, 30, 40 years, what will happen? And the result of such wrongdoings in the policy, we saw in 20 years after, almost 20 years US was in Afghanistan. And like everybody should accept and understand this. Another thing which we can learn from that example is actually cooperation. Why I was talking so much about the cooperation and co-creation between Ukrainian government and CSOs, because cooperation is a key for success. I hope that Ukraine will be a good example where we can finally see when the international community and donors finally starts to cooperate. I want to see this result of this kind of laboratory in Ukraine. That what not usually happens when the reconstruction is needed. Lots of political promises, but finally nobody is there when it is needed. So answering your second question about how actually we can reach the transparency, we should talk to each other. When we don't talk, when we just provide Facebook posts and tweets saying that no, they're doing wrong, no, that one is doing wrong, it doesn't help. I'm sure the government has their own reasons to close the information. Let's say open data leaders, yeah, or I don't know, fans, experts, they have their own reasons why everything should be open. Believe me, security and defense sector specialists and its employees have their own reasons for that. So we should all talk and understand that what will be mutually beneficial for all the stakeholders and for the country in general. It may sound boring and non-concrete, but this is the only way. Believe me, all the laws which we were advocating, it all started with discussion, with idea, and then discussions with a number of stakeholders. Sometimes it was taking years. Alex, you perfectly know how much time we spent for advocating and finally having high anti-corruption court. 3 years. 3 years. Studying all that international experience, starting from horrible and better ones. And finally, we created something in the middle, and that works much better than in many other countries. But yes, those 3 years were spent in dialogue. I'm sure that not everybody who listening to us, but in that advocacy campaign, there was even a moment when there were discussion between Ukrainians what the word binding was meaning in the conclusions of the Venice Commission. So we were trying to find the best way how to translate one word that was crucial. So communication, cooperation, and just talking to each other will definitely help us. Quite often we're not doing this, just saying that there is nothing to talk to them about. But this is not true. There is always what to talk about, especially when we're talking about the country with like 50% loss of infrastructure and energy, with thousands of people killed. And if you really want to build back better, we need to talk. It may sound like a political party elections, yeah, but this is true.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with you that sometimes lack of communication is the first problem in the row. When each party with good intentions is just not assuming the same about the other party, and then we end up in this kind of deadlock where we do not have enough communications and enough attempts to understand each other. Natalie, please.
Yes, thank you. I was actually trying to add about communication. So your question about the donors is very important. First of all, donors still have, even now, lack of communication and coordination between each other. This is a very big problem for everyone, because first of all, donors by themselves hate duplication of efforts, but they do not create a sustainable coordination mechanism. So there is no duplication of effort. So they are contributing, helping each other and Ukraine. But unfortunately, this mechanism, it is created, but it's not really working on a governmental level. It's a very weak mechanism. That's one thing. The other thing, civil society is communicating needs. Yeah, like we require transparency, we require rule of law, we require infrastructure, so on and so forth. But neither government, neither civil society is able to go and dig and construct. So here we come to business. Business is a very big player, and it should be part of discussion all the time. More to that, business is the owner of high-end technologies, best practices, also worst practices. But business is responding to the market. If market demands quality performance, business is performing quality performance. If market demands bribe to get into the market, the business is performing the bribe. Very simple. So business should be part of the discussion in any case. And I hope that this donor coordination platform that is established in Brussels, G7 plus IFIs, will have some kind of advisory groups, one from civil society, where it should be a group of people, ideally, because the reconstruction process will be a long-term process, 15, 20, 30 years maybe. Which will be changeable group of people every 3 years. Part of them are changing, for example, and the same advisory group from business, who could deliver the voice and speak their pain, because they have pain. Just imagine, simple question, there will be so many risks in after-war reconstruction, which now, we don't imagine. For example, unexploded ammunition. What if contractor finds unexploded ammunition? And it will be a common case. Who is taking the risk? Who is taking the costs? Where are the governance procedures? So IFIs should invest money not only in actual construction, but in governance, in management. It's very, very important. The biggest mistake of IFIs, they think that if they give the money, Ukraine has the capacity. Unfortunately, it's not true, because we don't have the experience enough. We were only on the early stage, so they have to support this, and they have to support the dialogue both with civil society, business, including, of course, the government. That's all from my side.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So then, Hani, please.
Thanks. I'm sorry for dropping out for a minute. Seems my internet connection is worse than wartime Kiev right now. The one thing that I would point out here is for donors is that, donors tend to think that because they're giving money and because they're going into a war-torn country, that gives them a certain amount of leverage in terms of how the accountability of the process will be run. And I think it's very dangerous to assume that sort of leverage, because Ukraine has very solid existing accountability and transparency systems. And so I think donors run the risk by focusing on their own existing systems of, in fact, undermining those created in Ukraine. An example here could be, for example, Prozora, where I imagine a lot of the donors are not going to want their funded projects to run through Prozora, which is quite unfortunate, because it means a fantastic tool to track those procurements is not going to be utilized. Same with the DREAM system that Andrei mentioned and Sergei mentioned earlier in the call. We have to make sure that donors fully utilize the existing infrastructure rather than thinking they have something better in place.
Thank you very much. So then I would kind of want to build a little bit upon what Natalie said about, like, you see the main priorities and the main risks at this point having to do with capacity, having to do with actually capacity of the government in design of infrastructure projects. And then, like, so the problem might come from actually not having enough experienced people working for the government, right? We have this international consultants that are funded by IFIs come in, and then their contracts expire. We don't have these people anymore. So I would open a question to, I would have a question to all of our panelists today, and perhaps asking to start with Sergei at this point. We already see some need in expertise or some need in assistance at this point. So the idea of this webinar is to create a working group of professionals of different kinds that can help and can contribute their expertise to this reconstruction. So how experts, from what you see at this point, how experts and organizations from Canada, from abroad, can be of use? What is the kind of experience and what is the kind of expertise that is needed the most to contribute to the successful reconstruction at this point? I will ask Sergei to start, and then perhaps everyone to offer their comments.
Colleagues, in terms of their actually what is needed, we have like several issues which are very much for us is crucial right now. First one, it's not only about funds, it's about expertise. And if you are talking about expertise, we are talking about the technology, and we are talking about the human resources, mainly for the capacity development. So from our side, we see the necessity to get the more let's say experience for implementation of the infrastructure projects, and to see how these projects are built up, how they are projected, how they are run, how the compliance is actually ensured. Because for us, it's actually one of the most important issues right now. Another challenge is actually, as I mentioned from the very beginning, is the companies which are already like implementing the huge infrastructure projects, to share the experience with Ukrainian companies, maybe to actually get in contact with Ukrainian companies and to do some joint projects, which will increase the overall capacity of Ukrainian private sector, but also like the supports the recovery and reconstruction like projects. And the last one is it's about the human resources. So one very important issue, it's about the trainings, it's about the like sharing experience in all areas, both for public sector officials and for the private sector. We have state-owned enterprises which are working in this field. So it will be also important for us to get the knowledge and experience in all the areas which will be necessary for the recovery and reconstruction. So definitely, I'm not speaking about like some like physical support, because we need like all kind of stuff for reconstruction in terms of transportation, we need buses, trams. In terms of the housing, we need temporary housing. In terms of the border crossing points, we also need temporary infrastructure, temporary bridges, and so on. So that's a huge need that we have. But as I mentioned, previously, it's not only about the physical stuff, it's also about the experience and the technical solutions, which very much in need right now here in Ukraine.
Thank you. Who else would like to contribute? I'd like to build upon another comment and ask you, Sergey, perhaps to share your view. Natalie mentioned today that Ukraine is not really frequently using FIDIC type of contracts in infrastructure, where you have the three-party contracts with client, contractor, and supervising engineer. And when we don't really see a lot of interaction between client and contractor. So is there any thinking in the ministry on implementing this or making this type of contracts mandatory?
Not sure about the mandatory stuff, but definitely this kind of contract is also actually discussed to be used. Like one of the opportunities that we can use right now during the recovery and reconstruction. But there were like cases for using this type of contracts in Ukraine in the past. So like we can enhance the work in this direction as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have questions now. Thank you, panelists. If you want to add something more, comments on like the need that Ukraine is experiencing, where this foreign experience, Canadian experience, can be the most useful, you're more than welcome to do that now.
I can actually mention from my side a part of what I mentioned generally in terms of the all stuff which is needed for reconstruction and recovery, taking into account that one of my mandated tasks it's about integrity. So I will be very much helpful if we can set up some sort of or working group or some sort of like at least list of people who will be eager to work with or who has experience to working with compliance, with internal controls, with risk management, and with audit. This is the very much needed the expertise specifically for my area of responsibility. I would be definitely like grateful for any support, how the risks are analyzed, how they are mitigated, in which are areas this is the let's say more on the what areas are on the higher risk. And how it can be mitigated from the state perspective or from the operational perspective within the institution or within even the private company. So for me, this kind of maybe very much working group conversation would be good. I have a team which is working in the ministry right now, setting up the system for the risk management for all state institutions within the ministry and in the ministry itself. And it's different kind of risk assessment and risk management systems for the state institutions and for the company itself. So from this perspective, would be very grateful to get some experience in place.
Thank you, Sergey. I see some of the participants already sharing with us their information, and I will gladly pass them that on. But now let me take questions that we have from our audience before we can move in. So the first one has to do with the corporate governance reform in Ukrainian state-owned enterprises. And Gleb Bakalov is saying basically that this reform is at risk of backtracking, or backsliding. And how can we persuade the public that state-owned enterprise boards are crucial for anti-corruption and not just for foreigners who are present on these boards mainly? I think it's a question for everyone. I'll perhaps ask Sergey to comment as well as Andrei to comment on that. As I know you were involved with the state, with the corporate governance reform in Ukraine. So
yeah, I mean, I don't see the real right now step back on the corporate governance reform in Ukraine. I'm just saying I might say that it's not moving that much fast as we could see it, but this mainly because of the voicing. In the, for example, good example in the ministry right now, that even now during the war we have started the corporatization of the state-owned enterprise airport Borispil at the moment. So I mean, work is like moving on within the ministry. There is actually a strong voice from the government, from the prime minister, who is saying actually that all the state-owned enterprises should be divided should be corporatized or should be set up as the state agency, but not the state-owned enterprise. Which this is the kind of path that's the government chosen, and it will be moving forward. We are also analyzing the effectiveness of the state-owned enterprises under the ministry right now. Under the ministry, by the way, we have 108 state-owned enterprises, plus we have state-owned enterprises under the state agencies under the ministry. So it's a huge number. Some of them, they are in the process to be handed over to the state property fund. And the moment they are right now moving in that direction. But for others as well, I mean, the audit should be done, and we should decide or to merge and make a corporatization of the state-owned enterprise, or just to give it for the privatization, or to change the form of its existence, like the state agency. If this kind of, because we have lots of state-owned enterprises which are not really doing the profit, they are living with the budget money only, and this is not the way how the state-owned enterprise should be operated. So yeah, I mean, we are definitely moving in this direction.
thank you. Andrei, would you agree?
I'm not an expert in this corporate reform, yes, but everybody remember the scandals with Naftogaz and different actions from the government. So I agree with Sergey. He's right that it's not moving, yeah, but actually this reform finally needs somehow to start moving from that point into the right direction. Is the wartime, is it a good time for this? I don't know. Honestly, but there was a question that in the question there was also the fact that all the foreign members of the supervisory boards receiving huge salaries. I don't have problem with this. I always saying that everybody who works for the state, or even if it's a state-owned enterprise, for me it means business, so they should have good salaries. Whether many of those companies which we would like to corporatize, right? They are fully operational, and they can now easily implement this reform. Not sure, honestly. So maybe it's a good time to prepare all the necessary rules, legislation, procedures in order not to backslide the reform, right? And I, in general, I believe in many reforms that Ukraine were happening or need to happen. It's now for some part of the society who's not on the front line and who's not dealing with daily operation of the country. It's a good time to think and to be prepared for the momentum when they can start doing that.
Thank you, Yohani.
Maybe I just want to add sort of a dose of realism about SOEs. I mean, SOEs are hugely problematic from a governance and corruption prevention perspective everywhere in the world. There's very few countries I know of that manage their SOEs well. Maybe the only ones that don't have SOEs or try to reduce their number to a minimum. So, I mean, here in Indonesia, where I am this week, all the state-owned enterprises had to get an ISO certification against corruption, right? ISO 37001. And they all passed the ISO certification with flying colors. And there's tons of corruption in the SOEs in Indonesia. So I think, you know, let's not judge Ukrainian SOEs with too harsh a standard, because we struggle with this everywhere. I mean, having said that, what might be a good time is to sort of reconsider some of the functions that some of the SOEs play that might not be quite as critical or central given their budgetary struggles in wartime.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I see we have one more question. We have a question from Noemi Gel, or sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but hopefully I'm not. And the question is, I guess, mainly directed to Sergey. To what extent would foreign managers and managers instructing or training managerial capacity will also have that in the executive and authoritative capacity to see the enforcement of their management go through? In other words, if I have a correct understanding of the essence of the question, like once we involve this expertise, once we have this training for management in the ministry, how do we actually make sure that all this training doesn't go like just in the vein, and we really see these new management styles being enforced in the ministry?
Look, this is not the question that you can answer in one sentence, because it's the, let's say, changing of definitely of some policies and procedures, which would be done after some sort of training and some sort of maybe looking at another perspective how it's done in other countries. Definitely some of the results can be seen with the concrete like KPIs which would be set, but it depends what the training is about. I mean, more training or more, it's not even about the training. The more experience we are getting, the more ideas we are like creating. So with this kind of ideas, it's not, I mean, not necessarily that the Canadian experience is the one that we should take and implement here. So our idea is actually to get as much as possible international experience, and to get the concept for Ukraine, which would be the most suitable here. So if you are talking about the forever compliance systems, so we see how the compliance works in the infrastructure projects in some Canadian companies, for example, and then see what kind of stuff is suitable here or not. Same thing, like maybe it's not even in general about compliance. It can be some very narrow topic like public procurement or due diligence or I don't know, internal control or facilitation payments, whatever. So you might not see the exact result after the training saying like, look, we got a training and everything changed in Ukraine. But definitely, I mean, training and sort of communication with the management level of the ministry would gives the possibility for the country, as the ministry actually formulates the state policy and actually changes the state of play in the country. So this is actually the level that should be first approached for some sort of experience sharing.
Thank you, Sergey. Thank you very much for your comments, and thank you so much for everything. Thank to every panelist. Thank for everything you shared with us today and time you spent with us. A lot of food for thought. Thanks to our audience today for being with us, sending your questions and your comments. I would also like to remind that links to the recording of this webinar, as well as all the ACLP webinars during the last 3 years, are housed on the Anti-Corruption Law Program LinkedIn page and on the Center of Business Law website. And that's where we will also share the information about how those of the audience who are interested in assisting Ukrainian government and contributing your expertise to the reconstruction, your experience to the reconstruction, can get in touch. Thank you for UBC technical team, Sarah McDonald and Stephanie Lee, for all your brilliant support in organizing the tech part of this webinar and all your work and time in preparation to it. I would also like to ask our panelists to stay around for a little bit. We would like to check with you just for several minutes. And with this, I will pass the floor to Susan Cote-Freeman, renowned anti-corruption expert and chair and president of Transparency International Canada, and member of the board of TI Global, for concluding remarks. Susan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think it's a difficult task to give closing remarks on this panel, which was really incredibly educational. I think we all have a sense of how difficult the task of reconstruction will be, but I think this discussion really crystallizes it. It will be massive and complex. But on the other hand, I think I have a sense of realistic optimism about it, and I think that's something we should all share. I think a lot has happened in Ukraine already to help sort of shore up institutions. They're still functioning in spite of what's happening there. So I think there's potential for lots of successes. I think we have to be realistic, but I think there is potential for leapfrogging to more resilient infrastructure, institutions, et cetera. And I sincerely hope that will happen. And I certainly hope that we can help in any way that you need or desire. I want to encourage Canadians, whether they're experts or companies, to participate in these efforts and to go there with the highest standards of integrity and to help build that in that country, rather than go there as if it were some kind of bonanza to make money and then to leave quickly, but to do things that will be lasting and that will help Ukraine. I also want to echo what Andrea has said about civil society and the call to include civil society, not as a reactive gesture, but as something right on the ground level. It's already begun, and our chapter there is incredibly active with other organizations. But I think that for everybody who's involved in Ukraine reconstruction efforts, to think of civil society as a partner, not just as another interlocutor that you should speak to. So definitely that call again. And in closing, I want to thank all of the panelists today, particularly those who are sitting in the Ukraine and the difficult conditions they're facing on a day-to-day basis. And a big thanks to the ACLP, Joe, John, and Norman for putting this together. And of course to you, Alex, for chairing and preparing this wonderful webinar. So thanks to everyone.